right, our course today, we're going to be talking about substantial improvement and substantial damage. My name is Celinda Adair. I'm a senior planner too at Atkins Realis, and we've put this together in coordination with and on behalf of Nevada Division of Water Resources. A little overview. We're going to do a brief introduction. We've already covered most of that. Then we're going to launch into key terms and NFIP overview. I realize this will be a refresher for most everybody on the call, but just wanted to go over a few basics before we kick off. Then we're going to get a deep dive into substantial improvement and substantial damage, and we're going to transition from that into talking about the disaster life cycle, the post-disaster responsibilities, and substantial damage requirements, so substantial damage assessments and determinations. And then we're also going to cover some things like substantial damage planning, disaster funding, and the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, Section 1206. And we'll round out our presentation with covering tools and resources, and then leave some time for questions and answers. Now, this is a 3-hour training. There is a 10-minute break in the middle, and we'll leave a good bit of time for questions and answers as well. And if you have questions, as Jenny said, feel free to put that in the Q&A. She'll be responding to some things as she goes, and there's other things I can respond to at the break or at the Q&A at the end. So first off, key terms. And last thing I'll say, if for any reason you have an issue being able to hear me or anything else, just flag that with Jenny in the chat and she'll interrupt me, or we can pause for a second if we need to and sort it out. So key terms. Flood. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, a flood is considered a general or temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of land that's normally dry. And that is water coming from overflow or inland or tidal waters, unusual or rapid accumulation of runoff, surface waters from any source, mudslides potentially. Could be the collapse or subsidence of land along the shore of a lake or other body of water as a result of water exceeding the typical levels, or something suddenly caused by unusually water-high levels in a natural body of water. Now, this is normally accompanied by an unusual and unforeseeable event that results in flooding. Base flood, we're going to use this term a lot. The base flood is a flood of the magnitude that happens on 1% annual chance each year. So each year, there's a 1% chance that a flood of this magnitude could happen. It's the area that would be inundated by the water and that magnitude of flood. It often gets referred to as the 100-year flood, but that does cause some confusion. A lot of times people think that means it only happens once every 100 years. So we try, especially when dealing with the public, to call it the 1% annual chance flood. It's also going to be referred to throughout this presentation as the base flood. And the base flood elevation, that's just the height the water gets to during that flood that has a 1% chance of happening each year. Another term we're going to use a lot in this presentation is the special flood hazard area. This is the area depicted on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps as being where the floodwaters are going to inundate the land during that base flood. So the area that has a 1% annual chance of flooding each year is called the Special Flood Hazard Area. This area is, under the National Flood Insurance Program, the minimum area that floodplain management regulations apply to. And this is where there's detailed riverine studies. Within the Special Flood Hazard Area, there's different flood zones. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And normally that area gets kind of broken down into the floodway and the flood fringe. So you'll hear people say the floodplain, and a lot of times what they're meaning is the special flood hazard area. And then within that floodplain area, you have flood fringe and floodways. So another way to look at this is what it looks like on the flood insurance rate maps that FEMA produces for communities. The blue hatched area is the floodway, which is a section of the special flood hazard area, and the whole special flood hazard area is all the area lit up in blue on the image. So depending on the age of the maps, the symbology, the colors, and the labels might look a little different. Some of the older maps are just black and white. Now we have these blue scales that are quite common, and some of the newer maps look even a little bit different again. It's good to get to know what these are for whatever community you're working in and just understand. Detailed riverine studies that are used to develop these maps cover the whole special flood hazard area, and in some cases they may also map what we call the 500-year, 0.02% chance annual flood, and that can exceed it. That's normally shown in like an orange color on most of the current maps. So we talked about floodway within that special flood hazard area, the 1% annual chance floodplain. There's a portion of it that is called the floodway. This is normally the channel of the river, and any portions of the area around the channel that is needed or reserved to convey the floodwaters that are going to flow through the volume of water in that flood that's predicted to happen as a 1% annual chance of happening each year. So the floodway has the deepest, fastest moving water. It's where the debris goes through. They try to reserve enough room to make sure that flow of water that's going to be fast moving and carrying debris can go through. As the water expands out, it moves into the flood fringe. That's normally where it's slowed down. There's not a lot of speed to it. Sometimes it's kind of ponding up, not a lot of velocity. And in this area, you still have regulatory requirements and permits, et cetera. So the whole floodplain is subject to local floodplain regulations, but there's some higher restrictions we'll talk about a little bit later on regulatory floodways. And it's just good to understand that the floodway is a regulatory concept. It's an engineering concept. So they map it by looking at the volume of water that's going to come down, and then when they put that amount of water and they run it through, imagine a tabletop-like diorama with the landscape topography of mountains and valleys and things. They push this water through there, and where it spreads out, the area that has to be inundated or kind of kept clear for that water to rush through and not get blocked up by things and back up and start spreading out worse, that's the area they call the floodway. It's a very simplified version of it, and the engineers in the room are probably cringing slightly at that, but it is, at a very basic term, that's the area they're trying to save and reserve to convey that flow. The area in the flood fringe is where it slows down and spreads out a bit more. Flood insurance rate maps. These are the maps that are produced by FEMA on behalf of communities. They're the basis for regulating floodplain development for NFIP participating communities. Here's a little image of a more recent one that has the blue, and the orange is the 0.02% floodplain, the 500-year floodplain. The blue is the special flood hazard area, or that 1% annual chance floodplain. You'll see some other things on these maps. Base flood elevations have traditionally been shown. That's that height the water is going to get in that 1% annual chance flood. And these maps are used by lenders, I'll talk more about this later, to determine whether a property that they've done a mortgage on has to carry flood insurance. So there's a flood insurance purchase requirement associated with these maps, or these are used for that purpose. Here's a little legend, shows you how this looks like. This is off the FEMA Map Service Center. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later too, but it's a website you can go to, and it's like Google Maps. You can type in any address, and you can find the community flood insurance rate maps and other information. And this legend shows you kind of what you're looking at on the screen. Some of the other features that are included on flood insurance rate maps can be the limits of the study. It can show you if there is a coastal map, you'll have coastal transects. There's water surface elevations, the base flood elevation line, the cross sections. That's a kind of a key reference point normally for determining where a exact base flood elevation is for a specific structure per se. Channels, levees, dikes, flood walls, other things like that. Now, the other piece that comes with it that FEMA produces is every flood insurance rate map has a flood insurance study associated with it. Essentially, this is a report that FEMA prepares that details and breaks down the analysis they did to develop that flood insurance rate map. It talks about where the data came from that they used, the age of the analysis, what type of modeling and information was done by engineers and used. This is the appropriate tool for determining a base flood elevation at a site for regulatory purposes with 1D modeling. Things are changing, and it may be with 2D modeling. that that's no longer true. The maps may become the more accurate tool in the future. Historically, this has been the tool we'd always direct people to use to determine the base flood elevations by looking at flood profiles, which you can kind of see a bad picture of the graph there. So traditionally, that's what has been used to determine the exact base flood elevation at a specific location or site. It's been the flood insurance study. As you get new maps, it's good to understand whether that's still the case going forward. A couple other key terms, last few. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, the definition of development is very broad. And a lot of people are used to thinking of development as structures. So if you say development, they're going to think a house or a commercial or industrial property, something like that. Under the NFIP, development is extensive. This is the full definition. I won't read it all out. But just know it includes things that can be as minimal as fences, as grading, filling, paving, temporary storage of materials, all the way up to what most people normally think of. It can include things like placement of tanks, like a propane tank, structures, of course, accessory structures, so things like that storage shed you can get from Home Depot. All those things are considered development under the National Flood Insurance Program and are subject to local floodplain regulations if they're placed within a floodplain or that activity is occurring within a regulatory floodplain, which is, generally speaking, the special flood hazard area under the National Flood Insurance Program minimum standards. Some communities can have higher standards, and they can, apply things to areas outside of that. So you always want to check for the community you're working in or with. Existing buildings, this becomes really important for substantial improvement, substantial damage. And a lot of communities, some of the buildings, or maybe all the buildings, were built before the flood maps ever came out for the community. We call these pre-firm structures because they were there before the flood insurance rate maps were issued for a community. A lot of times these aren't built to today's flood safety standards. Many communities have building standards that have kind of evolved over time. They may require, structures to be elevated. So we use the term freeboard here. Freeboard is any clearance or height above the base flood elevation that a structure is required to be elevated. So for example, if the water is going to get 2 feet high, I require 1 foot of freeboard. It means your lowest floor has to be elevated to 3 feet. So it has to be 1 foot above, have 1 foot of freeboard or clearance. Some of the other things is that over time, a lot of communities have prohibited enclosures, and in the past that may have been allowed are things like basements. You might have a basement in the floodplain that nowadays you wouldn't be able to permit or allow, but they exist on a pre-firm structure. So we're going to be talking about substantial improvement, substantial damage, and just understanding existing structures and what we mean by that. We're talking about pre-firm structures, things that were there before the flood insurance rate maps. Now we're going to do a little overview of the NFIP. Just some basics. It's a federal program. It provides access to federally backed flood insurance to communities that participate and agree to adopt minimum standards to regulate development within flood hazard areas that are mapped and identified by FEMA. Communities voluntarily agree to participate in the program. It gives their residents and themselves access to this flood insurance. Private insurers can write policies. They don't have to get National Flood Insurance Program insurance just because the community participates in the NFIP, but it gives them the option of accessing National Flood Insurance Program insurance. The reason why there was a big need for this was back in the 60s and 70s when the National Flood Insurance Program was established. There really weren't any insurance companies that were interested in maintaining insurance for some high-risk and flooded areas and structures, sometimes even whole states, where flooding is a very common occurrence across the U.S. And so the federal government got involved to provide an option, and the way they did it was to say, we'll provide federally backed flood insurance in exchange for you guys meeting some minimum standards to help ensure that new development that goes in is going to be built safely and more resistant to damage and help protect lives, et cetera. So there's 35 participating NFIP communities in Nevada, and one of the key things to understand why they participate is because flooding is the country's most common and costly natural disaster. In Nevada, it's the second most common natural disaster after fire. The NFIP helps in a couple of ways. Policyholders can recover after floods through insurance claims very quickly, generally, and they have financial resources then available to them. Just like your homeowner's insurance, which typically doesn't cover floods, having a flood insurance policy, if you have damage, you take photos, you file a claim adjuster or someone comes out and looks at it, and then you get, money to repair and rebuild. If you don't have flood insurance, it can be very difficult. You may not have many options open to you to get funding to rebuild or make repairs. Communities build safer and smarter. It's an incentive. By offering that access to flood insurance, there's an incentive to help ensure communities build a bit safer, and that helps try to drive insurance costs and other things down. So who's in charge of the NFIP? FEMA is designated in statute as the administrator of the National Flood Insurance Program at a national level. They then also pass that on to local states. Nevada Division of Water Resources has the floodplain management program that assists communities and oversees floodplain management in Nevada. But enforcing the National Flood Insurance Program is done at a local level because local communities individually sign up to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program and commit to adopting the minimum standards or something that exceeds that of the NFIP and enforcing that through regulating development that occurs within the mapped floodplains. So who can join? Cities, counties, towns, villages, parishes, special districts, states, tribal nations. It's quite wide. Communities with or without identified flood-prone areas can join. It should be noted that while FEMA maps flooding under certain conditions, flooding can and does occur outside of where FEMA maps it as occurring. Some communities have nuisance flooding or other issues, flooding caused by pluvial flooding or things that aren't stormwater runoff flooding that aren't tied to rivers overflowing, et cetera. So some communities want access to flood insurance even if they're not having mapped floodplains within, so they participate just to provide that access to residents to NFIP flood insurance. So NFIP participation, we'll just go through really quick what's involved in it. You have to adopt and enforce floodplain management ordinance or regulations that meet or exceed the minimum NFIP requirements or standards for development. We're not going to deep dive into that too much in this training. There are other trainings available that go through what all those minimum standards are, but they are specified in Section 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations 60.3. And there's standards that apply to how structures are anchored, elevated, what they're built out of, apply to other types of development activities beyond structures like grading or filling, and they apply to things like manufactured homes and RV homes as well as residential and non-residential structures. So there's quite a bit there. There's also things like technical bulletins and policies that interpret and enforce the rules and regulations as well. So there's quite a bit that's involved with regulating floodplains, but the minimum requirement is that communities adopt regulations that meet the minimums that are in this 44 CFR 60.3. Communities are evaluated periodically to see if their programs maintain compliance and meet the minimum requirements and if they're actually enforcing their floodplain regulations. They're always required to have some type of enforcement provisions somewhere in their code that ties back and allows them to enforce their floodplain management ordinance if they want to maintain compliance. If a community doesn't maintain compliance, they could be put on suspension from the program or probation. And if they're suspended, they're essentially kicked out of it. Probation, there's an extra surcharge, $50 tacked on to people's flood insurance policies. We're not going to deep dive into that on this training. But just for awareness, there are some repercussions if a community is suspended. Their residents lose access to NFIP flood insurance. If structures are located in a place where private insurers don't really want to touch them and provide insurance, it can make it very hard to resell them, essentially, because there is a federal requirement that anybody that's a mortgage lender and offers a mortgage using federally backed dollars, so like your FHA loans, your VHA loans, those types of things. If they issue a mortgage on a property in a floodplain, a special flood hazard area, they're required to ensure it has flood insurance over it so the federal investment is protected. If they don't, they're fined. And so if your property is in a MAP special flood hazard area and there is a requirement to purchase flood insurance by your mortgage lender, but you don't have access to flood insurance because your community suspended or doesn't participate in the NFIP, and or private insurers don't want to touch you because it's a high-risk property, it can be a challenge to try to sell or refinance a home. So that's a driving force for a lot of why communities participate in the NFIP. FEMA does have an audit process where they periodically go in and review, and states sometimes support, assist, or conduct those on behalf of FEMA. And they're basically checking to make sure communities are implementing their programs in a way that complies with the minimum standards. There's also additional disaster assistance available when communities participate in the NFIP that extends beyond kind of the bare minimums you have access to if you don't. So just keep those things in mind. Once again, though, it's not mandatory. While there are ramifications that I talked about before about not having access to federal flood insurance and potentially less access to disaster assistance, it is not a requirement for communities to participate unless a state has a higher standard that requires it, but that's not the case for Nevada. So now we're going to get into the focus of our training today, substantial improvement and substantial damage. So just to give you an overview, what is substantial improvement? That's any reconstruction, addition, or improvement of a structure where the cost of that improvement, what it's going to take to do it, is either the same or more than 50% of what the structure was worth before the improvement, and that's market value. So that's substantial improvement. And as you're going to see as we dive into it a little bit more, we're going to talk specifically about the cost and what market value is, but it's easier to get there than you might think, especially with today's construction costs. Substantial damage, that's when damage of any origin, so it doesn't have to be flooding for a structure to be substantially damaged. It could be wildfire, it could have burned down, it could be a mudslide as we're showing here, it could be an earthquake. Any type of damage that occurs to it. It could be a tree fell over on it. Anytime a structure that's within the special flood hazard area has damage of any origin, and the cost of repairing it or restoring it is more than 50% of what it was worth based on market value before the damage occurred, the structure is considered substantially damaged. So we're going to be focusing a lot in the second half of this presentation on what substantial damage assessments and determinations are and how to do those. So the other thing we just want to talk about briefly is improvements and repairs. These both equal development. We talked about that broad definition of development and how it encompasses, lots of things, anything from placing a propane tank to a fence to building a whole commercial structure. So improvements and repairs, substantial improvements or otherwise, and repairs to structures are all considered development under the National Flood Insurance Program. This means that they require a permit if they're going to be done to a structure within the special flood hazard area, and we're just going to call that the regulatory floodplain. And if a structure was damaged, a permit's required for the repair work. For any existing buildings, the community determines whether that improvement is a substantial improvement, and the community determines whether the building is substantially damaged. Anytime a substantial damage building is being repaired, it's considered a substantial improvement. So just so you get the relationship there, anytime you're repairing something that is substantially damaged, it's always going to be a substantial improvement. Last couple notes on that. A structure that is substantially improved or is being repaired or rebuilt following substantial damage must meet current standards for new construction. So this is where this can be a little bit controversial. If you are flipping a house per se, and you're going to invest a lot of money into it, and The idea is if it's being substantially improved, you're putting that much money into it, you should bring it up to code, bring it up to the current requirements for flood protection so that the property and the new buyer and whoever lives there will be safer from flooding so that your investment isn't at risk and you're not kind of throwing good money after bad. It's also if you're going to rebuild. If the house has been burnt down, if it's been substantially damaged, when it gets repaired, once again, that's a substantial improvement, so the same thing applies. It needs to be brought up to current standards so that it'll be safer from the flood next time, etc. And that's a requirement for all new construction and substantial improvements under the Code of Federal Regulations. So let's dive into what types of work might trigger substantial improvement, substantial damage. Sometimes it's quite obvious, something like a vertical addition or a lateral addition. Maybe the family's grown and they want to put on an extra suite, or maybe it's for a mother-in-law unit. It could be repairing, replacing, or extending foundations. Sometimes that's associated with an addition, sometimes it's not. Rehabilitation or remodeling, and that doesn't always mean modifying external dimensions. So if you're flipping a house but you're gutting the inside, and you're changing the layout, you're doing framing, you're putting in a new kitchen, replacing windows, any of that, that can be substantial improvement even if you don't change a single dimension externally. Restoration or repairs to restore a building to its pre-damaged condition, and reconstruction or demolition of destroyed buildings on the same site or foundation. So if the foundation is there and you're knock everything down and build it back on that same foundation, when you build it back, you have to build it back to current standards. Improvements or work on existing buildings where flood zones have changed or expanded, or the BFEs have increased. This one can be a bit tricky. Essentially, if you're improving or doing repair work on a building and it was originally mapped and it said the flood water was going to get 10 feet, and then it was remapped later with better data by FEMA, and now they've shown actually it's going to get to 12 feet, then when you go to do your improvement, you may need to elevate your structure up to 12 feet now, because now they know that's the actual flood risk there. So it can be a little bit of a moving target. So anytime you're doing a substantial improvement or substantial damage you want to repair, you want to consider that you might have to make a change to that structure to comply with the current standards based on the current flood risk information that's available. So before issuing permits in the special flood hazard area, you need to determine if a structure is substantially improved or substantially damaged. And the way to do that is to do a calculation. And the pieces that go into that calculation are determining the cost of work. That's the cost of the improvement or the repair, the market value of the structure before the improvement was made or the damage, calculating the percentage. So you're going to compare the cost of the work to the market value and determine whether that cost of work equals or exceeds 50% of the market value, unless your community has a higher standard that lowers that threshold to 25% or something. The minimum standard is 50%. You're going to calculate that percentage and make an official determination in writing. And we'll talk a little bit later about why that's so important to get the written determination. And you want to ensure that anything that is flagged as substantial improvement, substantial damage is going to meet the current applicable code requirements, and that's conditions of the permit. You always want to apply these rules uniformly and consistently to be fair and have a clear process. So let's walk through that substantial improvement, substantial damage formula. So the first thing you're looking at is the structure in the special flood hazard area? If it's not, then you don't need to proceed with doing a substantial improvement or substantial damage determination. If you have draft maps that have not been adopted yet, and while it's not in it now, but it will be, depending on the timing of that permit and that work, it's a conversation you might want to have, because you don't want them to get all the way through their planning process but not turn in their permit till after those draft maps come out and you've never flagged for them that now they would be in the special flood hazard area and this would apply. So just keep that in mind. So if the structure is in the special flood hazard area, you're going to calculate the cost of improvements or repairs, and we'll dive into that shortly, and you're going to divide that by the market value of the building. Now, if the total is equal to or greater than 50%, then it's going to have to meet standards for new construction. And we've got a little note there. That cost of improvement and repairs, as we're going to talk about more later, that includes all the work necessary to restore the structure that was damaged from any origin to its pre-damaged condition. So what we're going to be focusing on for the next couple sections are how you determine the cost of work, how you determine the market value, and then how you calculate the percentage. So cost of work first. Some key terms to understand for this part are cost of improvements. What we mean by that. It's the complete cost associated with all types of work being done. And the cost of repair is all the work necessary to restore a damaged building or manufactured home, et cetera, to its pre-damaged condition. So substantial improvement, substantial damage deals with structures, but that includes manufactured homes. So include the cost of all materials, labor, and other items necessary to perform the proposed work. And we're going to talk about this more later, but it doesn't matter who's doing it or if they had the materials before, the cost of those all need to be put in. So you can't avoid, including costs because you're doing the work yourself, or can't avoid including the cost of materials because you've had, say, replacement windows sitting around in your barn for, months or years. So you have to include all the costs, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in a second. And the costs, there are a few things you can exclude, though, and so we're going to talk about those here. Included costs are all the costs directly associated with the structure, so any structural elements, framing, foundation, you name it, interior finishing elements, that includes paint, that includes, the drywall, that includes cabinetry if it's built in. One of the key things is it includes everything that is built in. That could be HVAC, security systems, water filtration systems, your floors, any attached decks or porches, all of those things. And it also includes the overhead and profits. So you have to include that as well. You also have to include things like demolition or construction debris removal. But there are some costs that you don't have to include. The costs you can exclude are things not directly associated with the structure. So that's, per se, permit and inspection fees, any land survey costs, cleanup and trash removal, and that's different from the construction or demolition debris removal. That's, say, it was damaged and you've got mud and all this junk because it flooded. And so you're going to clean up all that trash and remove all that before you start the construction. So that's a little separate from demolition or construction debris removal. Landscaping or accessories, so your plants, you don't have to include the cost of them, or your, tree you want to put in the front yard, that kind of thing. Plug-in appliances like washing machines or stoves. Really, the way to test that is if you move to a new house, can you unplug it and take it with you? If it's more than an unplug, it's considered a built-in. So some people have stoves that are, built-in, not something they can take out. Others just have an electric stove that's plugged in, washing machines, et cetera. Some people have fancy built-in fridges that are completely built into the cabinetry and you can't take it out. Others, just slot it into a little alcove. So whether the appliances have to be included or not depends on whether they're built-in or if they're plug-in. There is a handy-dandy detailed list of included and excluded costs available in the FEMA Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference Guide. There's a link here, and we'll put that into the chat as well. But it is a great reference, probably one of my favorite FEMA guides. That's saying something. And it has really helpful checklists and information, and we're going to talk about it a few times as we go through this process. So other included costs: structural elements, exterior and interior finishes, utility, and service equipment. So here's some examples. Like I said, we've got some built-in stoves, so those are included because they're not just a simple plug-in. We've got the paint to cover up the walls. We have our, air conditioning units, et cetera, and we have, exterior finishes like our door and our front porch steps and things like that that are all permanently attached to the structure. So here's some other included costs: site preparation, excavation. We talked about demolition and construction debris removal. The labor. This is key. You have to include all labor, even if it's volunteer. And what they do is they use, Blue Book construction values, or quotes to price out what the labor would be, what the going rate is for specific trades or specific, activities being done like carpentry, plumbing, electrical. If someone's doing it all themselves, that's great, but they're still going to have to provide costs based on if they were paying themselves at least the lowest rates for those things. Construction management and supervision costs need to be included, and cost of compliance with other regulations or code requirements. So if they're required to do something specific to like protect it against wind or something else, or seismic, retrofitting, if they're going to put in something to anchor it for seismic reasons, they need to include all the costs that are going to go into that construction, build, repair, or new improvement. So I mentioned this a little bit. What about volunteer donated materials? It's really great when people do get donated materials, especially if they're substantially damaged and after a disaster situation. But you do have to include these items at their full market value when you're calculating substantial improvement and substantial damage. Volunteer labor, same thing. Prevailing wages, that's the appropriate type of construction or technical work. That's what you'd use to estimate it. Excluded costs. We're just going to dive into this a little bit more. So your survey for site grading, for elevation of the structure, elevation certificates, your landscaping, your beautiful pathways or fire pit area or whatever you've got, your cleanup and trash removal that's not demolition cleanup or construction debris cleanup, your permit and inspection fees, your cost to prepare plans and specifications, and anything you need to do, this is important, to temporarily stabilize an unsafe structure. So if it was damaged so bad that it was what they call a lot of times red tagging, where it's not safe to go in or be in that structure, if you've got to do some work to temporarily just shore it up to make it safe to enter and exit, just for construction review purposes, etc., you don't have to include those costs. You can also exclude costs to correct existing pre-cited violations. The key here is pre-cited. So if you've received a citation from a health, safety, or sanitary code violation, and they've said you have to do certain things to make this structure safe and comply with the code or address this violation, you don't have to include the cost to bring it up to code and address these violations, but you have to have documentation showing that a citation was issued and there was a violation before you put in your permit to do this work, and you have to only exclude the costs that are the minimum required elements to address that violation. So per se, if you've got a wiring violation and you need to fix the wiring in one room, you can't exclude the cost for wiring for the whole house, that kind of thing. The key there is the minimum necessary to assure safe living conditions. Documentation of the repair improvement costs. Permit applications have to provide estimates of that total cost of the proposed work, but they should provide enough breakdown or details that you can evaluate them. So one lump sum and say that's the total, that's what it's going to cost, isn't really adequate. You need itemized costs of materials and labor, some type of details so that you can check and make sure it really is all the costs are included. At the end of the day, the community accepts that from them. Then if FEMA comes in and audits the program and calls it into question and the community reviewed it and accepted that and said it was fine, the community is going to wear some of that issue if it is, or liability if it's flagged as a compliance issue. So if somebody writes something down on the back of a napkin and it doesn't really pass straight face test, but the community accepts it, then the community is going to be on the hook as well. So keep that in mind. Some of the acceptable sources of this cost information are, building valuation tables, kind of like a blue book for construction costs, get prevailing wage information and estimate costs for standard materials. You can get a quote from a professional or an estimation from a local official, so building officials. There's also FEMA Substantial Damage Estimator tool. We're going to do a walkthrough of that later in the Tools and Resources section. And there's some data and ways you can plug information into it and get an estimate from that as well. So a few different sources. If people repeatedly, or you're asking them for detailed data and they're not providing you anything of substance, there is an affidavit at the back of the FEMA Substantial Damage, Substantial Improvement Desk Reference that you can give them and ask them to sign and get it notarized. and show that they're kind of legally committing that those are the costs, a lot of times that will help people kind of get you better numbers if they're just refusing to cooperate. So that's an option your community can consider. But if that's something you're going to do and have as an option, we recommend you kind of build that into your process, flag it, and are consistent when you would apply and require it. So the next part of our equation is determining the market value. Market value is the price a seller can expect to receive from a buyer in a fair and open negotiation. There's two basic requirements. It has to always be based on the condition of the structure before the improvement work starts or before the damage event occurred. And it has to only be the market value of the structure, not the land, not the improvements, not the, or land improvements, not the accessory structures. You might have 6 outbuildings on there that are all accessory structures. The market value can only be for the structure itself. So a couple things to keep in mind there when you're calculating it. Professional appraisal is the standard approach. Many communities require permit applicants to go and get a professional appraisal. It has to be recent, has to be within the last 1 to 3 years, and has to be done by a qualified and licensed appraiser. Now, in addition, there's some other methods, and sometimes communities will say, well, we're going to use one of these other methods, and then if somebody appeals it, we will always give them the option to get a professional appraisal. You also, as a community, don't have to accept a professional appraisal as valid just because it comes from them. You can check the math, check the information, and question it if it just doesn't seem to pass a straight face test. Normally, when it's a licensed, qualified professional and they stamp or sign something, you want to accept it, but it's okay to just do a quick double check. I have seen some interesting things submitted before. So some of these other methods you can use either as a first off point or just be your standard, what you're going to use for market value, are adjusted tax assessment values. And you want to know what that adjustment is, communicate with the assessor's department, and you also want to make sure you're only getting the value for the structure and not the land or any of the improvements to the land or outbuildings. Estimates of actual cash value. You can get computed cash value from the FEMA Substantial Damage Estimation tool, and you can get qualified estimates from, a local official. I will say that last one is probably the hardest one to defend if you get pushback or appeals, so keep that in mind. Property appraiser values can potentially use these to see how comfortable, how far people are getting and whether they're giving you, correct information from those other sources. So you can do a test run for a property, and the community can pay for an appraiser of a property and compare that to the adjusted assessors and just see how accurate or how close on that is. These are some examples of appraisers that we've received in the past. You've got normally the details, and you have to make sure you've only looking at the improvement, the structure, and not the land. So you have to do some adjustments. So just keep that in mind if you're ever reviewing one of these. We're showing there, that's the improved home site value for each of these. So you'd never take the total, you're always just going to take the improvement. That's the structure. Now, if you have multiple improvements, you might have to dive into it a little bit more and be sure you just are taking the value for the structure that you're focused on. So a couple things to consider when you're reviewing private appraisals. Are they written for you? Were they written for a real estate transaction, or were they obtained just for this purpose? Sometimes things can be a little different if they were for a real estate transaction. Are there any misrepresentations, untrue statements, incorrect descriptions? Was the reproduction cost estimated? That's the cost to duplicate or replicate the building as is. Was there depreciation based on the building's actual age? And does the depreciation value consider neglect? So these are all things you can look at and review. So the case for actual cash value, when do you use this? Actual cash value, the cost to replace a building on the same parcel with a new building of like kind and quality minus depreciation due to age, use, and neglect. It's recommended because it is a direct valuation method that avoids bias. It works for all building and occupancy types, and it's usually more accurate than the adjusted tax assessment method. So in most situations, it's a reasonable approximation of the market value. It's what the FEMA SISD desk reference recommends typically. Now, communities a lot of times either use this or they use assessed cash value, and then some communities where their residents have the funds and there's enough appraisers available to make this feasible, some communities just require appraisals. So what level of accuracy is really required for the market value? Estimates can be used for both cost and market values. You want to be consistent, so you decide and document in advance the methods that will be used. So if you're going to allow one person to use, adjusted assessed value, someone else is going to use cash value, you want to be consistent. You want to establish what you're going to accept and be consistent with it. We recommend having standard operating procedures. We'll talk a little bit more about that later too. We also recommend you adopt a conservative method for determining market value. You want to seek accuracy, use precise methods. If there's a close call, you also want to make sure there's an appeal process set up and established so that if they challenge or don't agree, they can come in and you say you're using adjusted assessed value. You want to have an appeals process that gives them the opportunity to get an appraisal and compare or submit additional information to challenge that. So then you do your calculation. You've determined your costs, you've determined your market value, and you're going to calculate the ratio and see if it's equal or above 50%. And if it is, it's going to be substantial improvement or substantial damage. And in that case, you're going to issue a determination letter. Now, if it is substantial improvement, you want to capture on the permit form or in your permit documentation the calculation and all of the background data you had that you reviewed to come up with that calculation. So you want to be sure you've got the documents saved that show what the costs were, the documents that show what the market value was and how you determined it. All of that needs to be included in the permit file and kept for support so that that calculation could be replicated at a later point in time, say if FEMA came in to audit your program. If it's substantial damage, a determination letter is really essential. They can use that to help get access to increased cost of compliance funding that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And essentially, the key for making this determination letter and putting that in the permit file is that makes it clear that then the structure is going to have to meet development standards for new construction when they actually come in and do the build. So maybe after a disaster, you're assessing a lot of structures and making determinations and putting these letters in the file, and then over time, people are going to come in for permits to repair, and then whoever's reviewing that will see that letter and realize, okay, this is a substantially damaged structure, so whatever they're going to do here is going to be substantial improvement, it needs to meet current standards. That's that kind of flag. Depending on your permit system, there's a lot of different ways to flag that, but bare minimum, you want to issue letters, you want to make it clear to the property owners the determination, and you want to keep a file in perpetuity so that the property and the permits in the future are all handled correctly. Appeals and variances. If the applicant thinks the determination has been an error, you want to set up an appeal process. The appeal, needs to be heard and decided. The applicant, may request a variance. Variance request has to be supported by written justification. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, it is very hard to issue and receive a variance. It's very limited what's covered. It's different from typical land use variances that have a little bit more flexibility in them. So you need to make sure that issuing a variance would comply with the variance requirements in your local floodplain regulations or ordinances. And typically, it's very hard to get one of those for a substantial improvement, substantial damage situation. And record keeping, you always want to maintain all records associated with the appeal, any variance, whether it was approved or denied, and also just in general with your substantial improvement, substantial damage, determination, and calculations. All those documents should be saved kind of in perpetuity. What we talked about here was a lot of times communities will pick an established method. It could be adjusted assessed value for determining market value. And you just want to make sure you've got that process set up for how an appeal would work. And you want to reflect that in your flood damage prevention ordinance, ideally, your floodplain regulations. Historic structures, so this is one situation where there's a caveat, an exception to requiring that substantially improved, substantially damaged structures meet current requirements for development. So if a structure is truly designated as a historic structure, it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it's a certified historic district structure, federally certified, state or local inventory. Just note, we've got a picture here of the governor's mansion, but it's not actually in the floodplain. We just wanted to give an image of a historic structure. There is an exception where you don't necessarily have to bring it into compliance with current standards if it meets this requirement of being a National Historic Structure or, one of the other types of officially designated historic structures. And the other thing we wanted to flag related to this is temporary occupancy of substantially damaged buildings. So there's no NFIP regulation that prohibits homeowners from inhabiting substantially damaged structures, and the cost to shore up a structure, as we said, isn't included in the substantial damage, substantial improvement calculation. Where you have to watch that is to make sure that they don't extend from shoring up and turn it into full rebuild and development, and then try not to include those costs. So you just have to keep an eye on that. There's very important kind of emphasis here on making sure residents in the community understands the difference between a safety inspection and a substantial damage assessment. So when we're assessing substantial damage, we're just looking at whether the cost to repair those damages is more than that, pre-damage market value, or 50% of that. But that's very different from a building inspector or somebody going out and doing a safety inspection and saying, is it safe to be in here or not? So we want to be sure they're clear and they don't misunderstand and think just because it's substantially damaged, they have to leave it. That's not necessarily the case. There's structures that are substantially damaged that are still okay to live in, and that may be because a portion of the house, like a tree fell, it's substantially damaged, but the other portion of the house is still fine. So it really depends on the situation. There is this handout available as well online. If you Google it, it pops right up. So the next part we're going to go through is code compliance. So you've made a determination. You've determined structure is either substantially improved or it's been substantially damaged, so the repair is going to be a substantial improvement. So what are the current requirements normally the communities would have on their books to be compliant with the NFIP and under NFIP minimums? Normally, they're these types of requirements. You have to raise or elevate the lowest floor, so that, say, like this picture here, they're raising it up so the lowest floor is above the base flood elevation. You have to limit enclosures or prohibit basements below the base flood elevation. Once again, the base flood elevation is just the height the floodwaters are going to get in that flood that has a 1% chance of happening each year. You elevate utility and building service equipment, so your HVAC, your plumbing, all of your different electrical and things. Require flood damage resistant materials are used for construction, and ensure buildings are reasonably safe from flooding. So the minimum NFIP standards for structures generally fall into this category. This is the type of requirements that would apply then. Individual communities can and often do adopt higher standards, so it's really important to understand if a structure is substantially improved or substantially damaged. You need to look at those community specific regulations and see what the actual standards that new rebuild or improvement is going to have to meet. So they may have some additional standards here, or it may just be a higher bar. Maybe instead of elevating, and have the lowest floor above the base flood elevation, maybe it has to be 2 feet because they have a 2-foot freeboard requirement, that kind of thing. Now, compliance and ensuring that what gets permitted is actually built, that comes down to inspections and enforcement. Local ordinances under the NFIP, a participating community has to make sure that there is a provision that specifies an enforcement actions that can be taken if a developer or property owner doesn't comply with the requirements of the ordinance or the permit. It's up to the community to ensure that the permits, conditions, and information and review reflect compliance with their local floodplain regulations, but then sometimes what happens on the ground isn't what was permitted, and that's where the inspections and enforcement come in. So how do you correct violations if they're found? Stop work orders typically. Written notice of a violation, specify the required remedy, the sections of the code that have to be complied with, what specifically is required for that structure to be brought into compliance, and a timeline for when they have to comply. Enforcement, may look different depending on each community, how they're addressed, how violations are issued, whether they're issued by your floodplain manager or a code enforcement or compliance specialist. How that actually happens is a little different. So just make sure you're familiar with it for the community you're working in or with. And then we're almost to our break, but I'm going to talk really quick through increased cost of compliance, and we'll do a little knowledge check, and then we'll take a break. So increased cost of compliance. This is essentially a rider on NFIP flood insurance policies. So if a structure has a national flood insurance program, NFIP flood insurance policy that's backed by the federal government, they have this increased cost of compliance rider automatically there. And it basically gives them an additional up to $30,000 to help offset the cost of having to bring a flood-damaged home or business into compliance with your local regulations. So if the structure was flooded and it was damaged, and this is only if it was damaged by flood, but if it was damaged by flood and it needs to be brought into compliance with current regulations by elevation, et cetera, there's $30,000 that could help with that. The requirements, it has to be in the special flood hazard area, has to carry NFIP flood insurance, has to have flood-related damage, and they need it to be determined by that local official as being substantially damaged. That's where that letter comes in. That's why it's important to issue substantial damage determination letters, is because they'll need that to get access to this $30,000. It'll help them cover the cost of potentially having to elevate or, build a little bit differently when they build back to comply. So there's a few solutions that this funding can be used for. It can be used for flood proofing. We call this the FRED, flood proofing, relocating, elevating, and demolishing. These are the things that increased cost of compliance or ICC funding can be used for. They can be used as match for grants to do these activities as well. So these funds can help property owners elevate the house, relocate it to get it out of the flood risk area, demolish it, maybe they're going to go build someplace else instead, or do dry flood proofing for non-residential structures. The eligible activities, as we went over, these are detailed in the increased cost of compliance coverage guidance book for state and local officials. It was published in 2003, but it's still accurate for the most part. So it's still the go-to reference for how you can use ICC, and it does cover how it can be used for FEMA hazard mitigation assistance or hazard mitigation grant program grants that cover, between 75% or 90% of the cost to, say, elevate a structure, et cetera. And this ICC funding can be used as the match so that combined it can alleviate the cost for local residents of having to elevate, et cetera. If they get a grant, it can help to do the match for them. So what's the community's role in ICC? How does this involve them? The key here is to make that substantial damage determination and send that official letter to the property owner so they can access it. You want to enforce any repetitive loss provisions in your floodplain ordinance. Now, some communities have adopted provisions that say if your structure has been flooded multiple times, if it meets certain criteria and is considered a repetitive loss structure, then these special requirements apply. Essentially saying, either you need to eventually relocate it somewhere else, or you need to build higher, protect it from getting damaged again in the future, things like that. Provide mitigation options to policyholders. Help package these benefits with underfunding sources. That's the grants I was talking about, where you can try to package that $30,000 as the match for a larger grant. Coordination to issue building permits for mitigation measures, basically just making sure that if they're going to use this funding to do anything that's still development activity needs to have a permit. And then, of course, issuing certificate of occupancy or completion once the measure is completed, unless it's demolition, of course. So this is a standard flood insurance policy benefit. It helps to pay to repair or rebuild that flood damaged building. Once again, it's only available if the damage is due to flooding, and it's up to $30,000. It is available for repetitive loss, by flood buildings, but only if an adopted or enforced provision is in that local ordinance, and that's not a minimum requirement, so a lot of communities don't have it, but if your community does have one, then that's something that can be used for too. And what you have to do really is to just make sure you make those determinations, enforce the repetitive loss provision if there is one in your community's ordinance, help the policyholders, help the homeowner or business owner, et cetera, understand the mitigation options are, how they can use that $30,000, tell them about grant funding opportunities, et cetera, and how it could be used to leverage one of those. Make sure you're issuing those permits and issuing eventually the final certification of occupancy, et cetera. So before we go to break, we're going to go through and do a quick knowledge check or two here. So the first one is true or false, and I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat, is for substantial improvement, substantial damage, the two basic NFIP requirements for market value are: market value must always be based on the condition of the structure before the improvement starts or the damage occurred. Only the market value of the structure is included. So is this true or false? Are those the two basic NFIP requirements for market value? Put what you think it is in the chat. I'll give you just a sec for that. Okay, so now I want to just check this one other way. Everybody remember where those green check marks are. Go up and turn yours off for a sec so it turns on, it turns off. If you're seeing one by your name now, go ahead and click it once and just turn it off. And I'm going to ask everybody that thinks this is true to put their green check mark on. I'm seeing lots of trues. And a red X if you think it's false. Okay, everybody's a green check mark. You got that one right. That is true. Those are the basic requirements for market value. There's a lot of ways to calculate market value through adjusted assessed value, actual cash value, an appraisal, et cetera, but these are the two basic requirements. Now we're going to do one more knowledge check, and then I'll let everybody take a break. Which of the following mitigation actions can the ICC, or increased cost of compliance funding that's associated with NFIP flood insurance policies, be used for? Remember my FRED acronym. So if you want to put either in the Q&A or the chat if you think it's A, B, or C. All right, and the correct answer for this one, I'll see a few people going in now, so I'll give it one sec. I think most people put C, and that's correct. Floodproofing, relocation, elevation, and demolition. Some of these others sound valid. It could have been true. This was a very tricky one, so I apologize for that. But it is C, that's the correct acronym for FRED. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So I think we're at 11 after. We'll come back at 21 after. I'll stay on during the break for a second. If you have any questions about what we've covered so far, feel free to put those in the Q&A. And we will have a question and answer period at the end as well. We launch into this next section, which we're going to be covering more of the disaster life cycle, really what that post-disaster situation is and how that involves substantial improvement. Do you want to give me a smiley face with the sunglasses on if you've done substantial damage assessments or determinations before? That one's just right over to the right of the green check mark and the red X. Oh, looks like a couple of folks have. That's great. Well, if there's anything you want to add in, I think I learn something almost every class I teach, and learning from the other participants is always just as valuable as what I can offer as an instructor. So as we go through this, if there's tips or tricks that you learned from your own experience you want to share with others, feel free to put those into the Q&A or into the chat, maybe in the Q&A so that Jenny can keep the chat clear in case anybody has technical issues. But go ahead and drop those in because I think it's valuable to share, that information amongst people. Everybody's had slightly different experiences with it, so feel free to add in. All right, we're going to launch into disaster life cycle. Now, just to be real clear, the disaster life cycle is much bigger and broader than post-disaster response and substantial damage, substantial improvement, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So we didn't try to cover everything here just for the purposes of time. Wanted to get through all the key stuff. But we did want to cover post-disaster community responsibilities generally. So we want to talk about this a little bit. It's important for local floodplain managers, to communicate with the local officials before a disaster hits, ideally, and talk about what the plan would be when a disaster happens. And they need to have their elected officials support when residents, begin pushing back on things like substantial damage requirements, and we're going to talk about how and why that can happen. Typically, anytime someone's going through a stressful situation like a disaster, being told that to repair they're going to have to do something different or something that's going to cost them or can cause them stress. I fully understand and been through that myself. So it's a situation where people can get pretty upset. Having the elected officials understand what substantial damage is in advance, why they do it, that it's trying to protect folks going forward in the future so they don't have damage again, or make sure that their lives and their property are protected, and giving them some things they can communicate in advance goes a long way to making your job as a floodplain manager easier, to making the local residents understand, why this is being required, so it doesn't just feel like a meaningless punishment for having to rebuild. And it helps that local official become an advocate and a supporter for the intent and the effort. So that's something we highly recommend. It's also important to communicate the permits are required in a post-disaster environment. I know people want to get themselves repaired and back in there ASAP. Permits can take time. Some communities look at doing things like waiving permit fees or things like that, or streamlining the permit process or bringing in more staff to help. But it is important that FEMA is still going to come in and look at your community, especially after disaster. And it is something you sign up for when you join the NFIP as a community. You commit to requiring permits for development within the special flood hazard area at a minimum. So keep that in mind. Disasters don't void that permit requirement. Additionally, you want to notify property owners of potentially substantial damage structures as soon as you can. So getting out there and doing those substantial damage assessments early and getting those determinations made and letters out there so that people can plan and are aware that they're going to have potentially additional costs. They can try to access their increased cost of coverage, $30,000, if they have an NFIP flood insurance policy and it's flood-related damage. Basically, the earlier they have that information, the sooner they have that in their planning process, the less of a surprise it is when they're, 3/4 of the way through all their plans and all of their work for their rebuild, and then they find out they have to do it different. It's the earlier you get it out there, the better. A couple other things, in general, you're responsible for is really to go out and assess that damage, determine if a structure is substantially damaged. You don't want to go out until it's safe to do so, but once it's safe and you're able to, and notify the property owners. Now, in things like a wildfire situation, I know we had some pretty bad ones out where I live in 2020, and it can be difficult to get notifications sometimes if there's no mailboxes, if they burnt down or something like that from a wildfire. So looking at means and avenues you have to do notifications in advance, something we encourage, and looking at making sure you have information posted on a website of who to contact to check, and flagging on social media or in other places that they want to check and see if their structure has been determined as substantially damaged before they do any rebuilding or get too far into their plans. Those are all things communities can do proactively. The other things, post-disaster community responsibilities, you're looking at providing that technical assistance to survivors. Floodplain managers, may not be the first person they're seeing. They may have already had somebody out there doing a damage assessment to see if it's safe for them to be in there. Life safety, risk assessment. It's important when you go out and do substantial damage assessments that you convey, what the difference is. If you go out as a team, some states and communities are set up so that they go out and they have floodplain managers or somebody going along to do substantial damage assessments at the same time that they're doing structural safety assessments and, presidential disaster declaration assessments where they're assessing to see whether the damage meets the threshold for public assistance or individual assistance, things like that. But you want to be sure you're clear on what your assessment is looking at and what it means and how it's different from those others. You can support communities by helping them understand what the requirements are for documenting the costs of materials and labor and some sources they can get that information from. You want to be real clear and have a consistent approach to what you're going to require for the market value determination so that they understand what they need to give you and it's as clear for them as possible. And provide those official notices in a timely manner so that they've got a clarity on whether they are being determined to be substantially damaged and substantially improved, and whether they're going to have to take that into consideration when they rebuild. Like I said, the sooner they know that, the better. And the toughest thing is you got to regulate your substantial damage structures and make sure that they do comply. There is that exception for historic, but you can't waive those requirements without jeopardizing participation in the NFIP from being non-compliant. So we're going to talk through the details about how you do substantial damage assessments in the NFIP. So preliminary damage assessments is an umbrella term, used in emergency management. Encompasses that initial damage assessment. You go out and look and see what level of damage occurred after a damage event. And there's, that joint preliminary damage assessment. These assessments are used to support disaster assistance requests that you're going to make up, through the state, and that'll eventually go on nationally for a presidential disaster declaration consideration if the disaster and the damage event was large enough. Preliminary damage assessments are not the same thing as substantial damage assessments. These are initial assessments of the value, the potential damage in an economic terms, so that they can determine whether it meets specific thresholds to qualify for a presidential disaster declaration and for public assistance or individual assistance. So those are different than substantial damage assessments. And there's some overlapping work in that you're both going out in the field and looking at what damages occurred, but the data you're collecting and how that's compiled and how it's used has some key differences. It's important to clarify for elected officials how your substantial damage assessments are different and what you're going to need to collect and what tools you're going to need to make your determinations and how that's different from the rest of this process. Coordination with emergency managers so that you're in alignment, and where there are overlaps for the data you're collecting and or you can join on to a damage assessment team so that you've got potentially building inspectors or, building officials or experts that are out in the field with you that can make it easier for you to make your substantial damage assessment. You can be another set of eyes and collect data and share with them as well. That's a real beneficial way to do it if you have that option. So post-event damage assessments, you're going to go out into the field as soon as possible after that damage event when it's safe. You want to go out timely because people start cleaning up and repairing things right away. Once it's safe too and they can get back in, most folks don't hesitate. It's key to get the damage assessments done early so that you can inform them as soon as possible about what requirements they're going to have when they repair, et cetera, if they are qualified to substantially improve substantial damage. And you also want to have some in-office supported communication. So if you're sending people out into the field to collect that information, you're going to need some people or some time in the office to review that, compile it, save things into the permitting system, put your documentation together, et cetera. So communications with property owners, just want to note, that's going to take place kind of throughout that post-disaster recovery phase. You want local officials and emergency managers to be aware of and recognize that substantial damage determinations can generate a number of questions from home and business owners so that they're prepared to respond to these questions as well. Giving them a cheat sheet and some basic talking points of how to respond to those questions, let them know they can direct people to you for that, and just making sure they're aware so if they're asked by a property owner about it, they don't go, "What are you talking about? Never heard of it." Nobody wants to hear that from the elected official or emergency manager if they're hearing something else from the floodplain team from the same community. So just make sure you're in coordination. Most communities do this real well, but it's just something to think about. There's a lot of things that need to be pre-planned, before you go out there and just go into the field. You can plan your routes, make efficient use of time, etc. You want to make sure that your people that are going out to the field have the tools they need. They're familiar with the substantial damage process. If you have a substantial damage plan, we're going to talk about these more later. This would be the time to take it off the shelf and use it. We'll go into depth as to what we should include or what we'd recommend you include as a substantial damage plan a little bit later in the presentation. But if you have one, you're going to take that off and see who you assigned or identified that could be doing these substantial damage assessments, what tools and resources, what data collection method you're going to use, who's going to be reviewing the information collected, making the determinations, writing up the letters, and all these other pieces. So if you need training or resources, you want to look at that and figure out how you're going to get the folks that are going to go out in the field trained up. I know personally when I was working as a state NFIP coordinator, a couple times I'd deploy out and go to communities and when they'd had a flood or disaster and provide some training, in the joint field office and then take them out to the field, and we do literally on the ground hands-on training to look at how to do these when folks didn't have that experience at the local level. Staff turnover a lot. It can be hard to keep that experience around. A lot of times communities help each other out, share resources, or the state can provide resources, and or depending on the size of the disaster event or the damage event, FEMA staff may be involved as well. And you also want to consider what level of damage. So the tools you're going to use to collect this may vary slightly depending on the level of damage that's occurred. If you've had, 80% of your community impacted, that might be a very different rollout picture than if you've got 10 homes. So unless that is 80% of your community. So it just depends. A couple of things you want to think about. What are the community capabilities for staffing and resources? Do you need to bring in help? Do you not have enough people to cover the area? If you've got, hundreds of homes that have been damaged and you want to get through these, assessments on the ground quickly, do you have enough staff for that, or do you need to, leverage more? If you have a substantial damage plan, you should kind of have that identified with kind of response levels. As I said, depending on the size of the damage event, you'd have, different resources flagged that could be pulled in. If you don't have that, that's something, you can work through emergency management, et cetera, to try to request assistance with a lot of times. You can leverage state assistance. Sometimes you can use staff like the county assessor staff. Normally after disaster, they have to go out and reevaluate property values. They may be willing to go out and do field. So you got to look at within the community and look at your resources and see, who you can leverage for this, and make sure you put a realistic plan together to cover and do the assessments within the, a reasonable, timely time frame when you're actually going to be able to see the damage still, based on the number of structures and the amount of area you got to cover. Has there been a major disaster declaration? Why that's really important. Presidential disaster declaration means there may be FEMA resources and staffing available, or there may be some type of contract support through FEMA. We're going to talk under Disaster Recovery Reform Act Section 1206 a little bit later, how some of this ramp up, if you need to bring in external parties, could be reimbursable if it happens within the first 180 days. And then the next thing we're going to go into is, has the community determined when these substantial damage assessments will be conducted? So what equipment do you need? So things like this, I know personally, I've been in some floodwaters where I was really glad I had my protective boots and everything else on. Now, normally, you know, you want to go in after the flood order has gone down, but you're still sometimes walking through some pretty murky stuff, and it's literally whatever sewage and or chemicals and or other things have all run off and is mixed together in the flood water. So you want to make sure anybody going out in the field has personal protective equipment, PPE, has technology they need to, you know, take photos, assess the damage, and make sure you've got the right, you know, equipment and gear. And make sure you have somebody ideally that has some experience with, you know, construction or building, so they understand kind of the different elements, what they're looking at. So how many people do you need on the team? How many teams will be, what their routes, planning that ahead of time, picking a team leader, coordinating, making sure that, you know, you normally want to go off in groups and cover an area where you can keep sight of each other or be around. So be careful people aren't going off isolated by themselves in an area that might still have some danger from whatever hazard was causing the disaster. What time frames, what's acceptable, you know, what that type of aim you should be for number of houses that you're inspecting or looking at per hour. Have a plan in place and make sure that you're kind of keeping track of what people are doing, how many hours they're spending, what areas they're covering. Once again, if you have a substantial damage plan, you can plan some of this out in advance, but always, you know, with a disaster, you don't know exactly what structures or what areas are going to be hit ahead of time. And so sitting down and making a plan before you go in the field, it's going to save you a ton of time. It's going to make it way more efficient and really worth it. I know sometimes just go out, get it done, go in the field, but 9 times out of 10, you're always going to come up way better if you stop first and, you know, put a plan together. Just remember also, these are really just estimates. You don't have to overcomplicate this process. You don't want to make it sound, you know, too crazy to the people out in the field doing it. You know, there's specific information we're talking about here that they're going to collect about the damage they see. They're going to take photos, etc. But you know, make sure you manage their expectations on the level of detail. You don't need to count, you know, every time a paint is chipped on the side of the structure. Some people, that's common sense and easy. Some people need to be told that. Just be aware that whoever you're working with, you know, it's always good to say some of those obvious things out front. I've had a funny experience where we had somebody from a community went out and they were just a very detailed person, and I think they spent about 2 hours just on, you know, 2 or 3 structures. And you could only see them from the roadside, so they were really going crazy with it. So just make sure you manage kind of expectations around what level of detail. These are kind of triage assessments. You're trying to assess the damage to different construction elements of the structure, but you don't need to be, and you're taking photos, etc., but you know, you don't need to hand draw diagrams showing everything in extreme detail or something like that. So just kind of manage expectations. Now, how you're going to document it, that comes down to it. Some communities have handheld devices, tablets, laptops that can convert into tablets, take photos, etc. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. We do recommend that you take some basic things into the field. At the very least, you want a paper sheet, an Excel printout, or something that lists. We've got an example kind of here, and there's examples in the FEMA SISD desk reference to show the list of the elements you're going to be looking at on the structure. You know, basic things like roof covering, exterior finish, you know, the electrical, plumbing, or HVAC things that are evident, doors and windows, that kind of thing. At the very least, you know, you want a clipboard and a, you know, plastic or protected pack of these sheets that you can fill out one for each structure. You want to make sure you're noting on them, you know, who's collecting the information, etc. So that's at the very bare bones. Maybe you've got 10 structures, you're just going out and you're just going to print out these sheets and fill them out for each one. Now, if you have hundreds of structures, normally, ideally, or hopefully, you're doing one of these other options, which they have the FEMA Substantial Damage Estimation tool. That it's a GIS, Geographic Information Systems-based tool. You can drop data into it, and then you can use collect data in the field and plug information back into it. Survey 123 is an app that a lot of communities we see out in the Pacific Northwest and in Region 9, and including your area, have adopted and used, because you can go out in the field, set it up as a simple form that's going to collect the information based on each of these, you know, categories like shown on that sheet. And you can take pictures, upload it, and it takes little geolocation points to show exactly where you are so you can track what structures and that kind of thing. It doesn't matter how you do it so long as you're collecting the required information, looking at the required things, and that you know in advance, and are clear with people how they're going to do it. You don't want people to just handwrite a bunch of crazy stuff in a notebook and pass it to you at the end. So just make sure you're clear on that piece. You also want to identify who's going to kind of verify the accuracy of the data. Doing it in pairs is good. You have two sets of eyes, two people looking at it. They check each other's work as they go, and then someone's going to be reviewing it back in the office. Some of the documentation that's real key, verifying the address. There are times that can be really hard after a wildfire, for example, where it's just really hard to tell what structure you're looking at. So that's why having electronic capacity on your phone or a tablet or something so you can Google Maps and at least get an idea of where you're at. In a flood situation, it typically can be a little easier unless structures have washed off their foundations and gone downstream. So verify the address, describe the damages. Now don't, enter it unless you're in a situation where you're with a disaster assessment team that has a building official and they are, have the authority to enter a structure and can do so safely and ensure the structure is safe. That would be the only condition. Normally you're always looking at things from the outside and you're doing the best you can to estimate what the damage inside is. Estimate the depth of the flooding, when it's safe to approach the structure, or use tape measures, things like this to measure it. You can see those water lines. It's normally pretty evident. It's one of the reasons you want to get out there quickly. These can get scrubbed off, cleaned up, dry out. It can be harder to see it the longer it is after the disaster event for a flood situation. And take photographs. I don't think anybody's ever gotten in trouble for taking too many photographs of documentation in the field. So take photographs, different angles, different sides of the structure, all of that. Documenting consistent values for estimates. So determining how you're going to define market value at the start of the exercise so that you're doing it for the same for every structure is going to make your substantial damage determination process much easier. And the same thing for how you're going to estimate the cost to repair. You want to make sure people aren't putting in, random numbers there. You want to establish, I'll go back to this one for a sec, that if you have a building official at the community that can provide access to those kind of like Blue Book evaluation tools for what materials generally cost, and so you look at the repair cost and estimate it. You're documenting in the field what the damage is, but then you've got some work back to do in the office to actually see what that translates into in terms of dollars. So there are also situations where communities have higher standards, and there can be some misunderstandings then about NFIP requirements. It is really important that communities implement and apply their higher standards even after a disaster, because under the National Flood Insurance Program, your higher standards become your minimum standards, essentially. So you can't really waive higher standards unless you formally update your ordinance, which we don't recommend doing. You get pushback on that from the folks that had to comply with it if you kind of change it for disaster providers or disaster recovery folks. So it's common for communities to repeal their higher standards, but we really recommend that you don't. This can be a thing that can cause a lot of confusion. Sometimes FEMA folks will come in. You just want to make sure everybody that comes into your community is providing support with substantial damage assessments or anything else floodplain related is aware of your higher standards, that you've communicated them to elected officials, and anybody else is going to be talking to community members. And once again, to avoid a noncompliance issue with the NFIP, you want to make sure you're implementing them unless they're formally repealed. Some of the higher standards we see a lot of times is, including repetitive flood damage, repetitive loss in their definition, adding costs of improvements over a specified period of time. So we call that cumulative. So when you're determining if something's substantially improved, you're not just looking at the cost of that one repair or that one improvement. You're looking at them, over, say, 10 years. And when it reaches substantial improvement, the final one that could do that would just be maybe updating siding or, maybe adding a carport on, something like that, and that could get them there. Lowering the substantial damage threshold, so instead of 50%, it's 45%, something like that. One of the key things you want to do throughout this whole post-disaster process is look at how you're going to communicate with people. Anticipate that they're going to be frustrated and unhappy and stressed out. You want to try to do everything you can to accommodate folks and help with that. A lot of that's being responsive, being timely in your assessments, giving them clear direction and guidance. While you can't waive requirements, you can clearly convey them. You can provide them simple documentation that shows them what the requirements are. You can be timely in response and available. And sometimes you can just sit there and let them vent and get mad at you and stay calm and then carry on. That's all those things are things you can do for your citizens. One of the things you want to do is making sure your elected officials are aware and don't unknowingly spread misinformation. There's a great ASFPM series of documentation called Understanding Floodplain Management, Flood and Managing Flood Risk, a guide for elected officials. There's 3 volumes of it. If you can get your elected officials to review those, if you can set up a meeting with them to cover them, those are helpful. At the very least, give them some key talking points on substantial damage, substantial improvement, and your floodplain program so they're not surprised or don't kind of wave and say, oh, we can waive that when they can't kind of thing. And one of the last things you want to think about is collecting high water marks. So while you're out in the field, you're already doing this work, it's an opportunity to survey or document high water marks, high flow events. This is when it's a flood disaster, obviously not really applicable to a wildfire or a landslide or something else. You want to look for seed lines or debris lines, those mud lines, kind of like I showed you in the photos before. You want to document those as soon as it's safe because that's, they fade or can get wiped away, removed, etc. And you can get residents involved. You can, if you have the abilities online or on your website to give them a way or an email address where they can email them to. A lot of times communities, especially with social media today, you can collect them on a social media account. You can get your residents to post and show a lot of information. The key is trying to make sure that if they provide that they show you the correct details. So community level substantial damage planning. So how can you plan for disasters before it happens? How can you make your life easier so that when you're going through all the things we just talked about, that process, it goes as smoothly as possible? There's a lot of ways. Communities, have hazard mitigation plans where they're looking at actions to, mitigate and prevent the damage from occurring in the first place. Some communities have flood plans, substantial damage plans, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And as part of those substantial damage plans, or separately, which is why they're their own call out here, vulnerability analyses to show what structures are at risk for different types of hazards. A lot of times that might be incorporated or part of your hazard mitigation plan. And National Risk Index, which is risk data provided by FEMA, et cetera, that you can learn more information about your community if your community doesn't have a lot of risk data available. So why would you do a substantial damage plan? How does it help? The idea is you're going to sit down and talk internally and work through, who is going to do what in that post-disaster situation. So you can document the processes you're going to follow, the tools you're going to use, and the responsible roles or staff, and then look at that for a small-scale disaster up to a large-scale disaster and kind of plan out in different scenarios who's going to do what. Having assigned roles and responsibilities avoids confusion and lets people react quickly. Having the tools identified, and that can be, having a Survey 123 app built, set up, and form ready, or whatever, even if you're going to do paper forms in the field, making sure you've got that all ready to go. It's just sitting there in a file, ready to print out copies. You can do some advanced route planning to say, set your community up by grids into sections and say, depending on where it is, this is how many people you need to cover this section. And so you can plan in advance, how many staff you're going to need depending on the number of sections impacted. There's a lot of different things you can do there. You also want to look at your outreach tools. How are you going to communicate, depending on the different type of disaster event, about substantial damage with the community and get information shared? You can plan for all of that in advance. It makes it so much easier when it happens then to grab, that plan and be like, all right, it's clear, you do this, you do this, you do this. Here's the tool. Here's the outreach thing. We just put today's date on it and fill in a thing or two about the specific disaster and go. That is a lot easier than trying to figure all that out while you're in the middle of an actual disaster. So we really recommend it. A couple extra benefits. You can get extra community rating system credit. I've got a whole slide on this in a minute. The community rating system program is a voluntary program communities can join that gives them credit for activities they do that go just above and beyond the minimum requirements for being in the NFIP. And if they get enough credit, they get different ranks from 1 to 10. 1 is the best, 10 is the bottom. And depending on what rank they are, they get a discount for all residents and the community properties on flood insurance. So, Class 2 communities, 45% discount. It's 5% increments. So, 9 is a 5%. It's a really good program because it incentivizes your regulations. Basically, you say, well, we comply with our regulations and we make sure you're safe, or we adopt a higher standard and we'll save you money on your flood insurance. Depending on how many insurance policies you have, the math about whether it pays off to be in the program and the benefits that come with it depend. I used to work for a Class 2 community, and it can take a lot of work to put the documentation together to provide that, but the benefits were huge because we had a huge amount of flood policies, and saving everybody 45% on their flood insurance policies was great, and provided pressure and benefits for enforcing our regulations. So standard operating procedures, we recommend these go into and are included with your substantial damage plan. It's really just writing down who's going to do what in a consistent, easy to read approach, making sure it's clear enough that if you won the lottery and went off to a sunny, beautiful place, we'll pick Hawaii, why not, that you would be able to hand it to someone else, they could pick it up and do it the same way consistently. You also want to look at your procedures and data sources. So who's going to do the field work, how that cost of work information is going to be collected or determined, the source for the market value. Are you going to use adjusted assessed value? Are you going to ask the assessor's office for an export of that? What type of data cleanup needs to be done so that it's ready and usable? Thinking through all the steps and who's going to do them and then documenting that. The same thing for how you're going to calculate and document the calculations and those official substantial damage determinations. Having that substantial damage letter template ready. There's a template example in the back of the FEMA SISD damage desk reference. And you can essentially, format that in advance, have it ready to go in a file so that when it's time to populate it, you're just changing addresses and some specifics. And really how you're going to make sure that you have somebody overseeing and making sure this is all working. That's kind of a key thing. Another thing to put in here, to get credit for the CRS program, and we just recommend it in general, you want to look at what structures are at risk before the damage occurs. At the very minimum, this could look like your community looking at your special flood hazard area and using GIS or another tool to create a list or identify in a map all the structures that are within the special flood hazard area. Then, at the very least, you have a list of the structures that, if a flood were to occur, could potentially be damaged. And then, depending on when the flood happens and you get information about that, you can overlay it and see who's impacted. So that's kind of the bare minimum. You can take that steps further. You can do analysis that pulls in and populates detailed structure data, like was it built on slab on grade? Is it old pre-firm? Is it, what date or year was the structure built? What type of construction? What type of foundation? Is it elevated or not? That kind of information. The more you populate in, you can do some kind of complex analysis by intersecting that structure data with your hazard data. So things like, first you've got your boundaries to show, okay, is it in the floodplain? And then you can look at base flood elevations or depth grids to show how high the water is going to get. And then based on the type of construction, You can tell, okay, it's likely to, you know, and this magnitude flood, it's likely to have 3 feet of water there. Okay, so that's what we're anticipating would happen, you know, if a flood gets to this level, if the river rises this much kind of thing. Then you can calculate and turn that into dollar values, because there is some tools built by the Corps of Engineers and by FEMA that calculate the likely damage based on the depth of the water in structures of certain type based on square footage. So there's calculations, the SDE tool, the FEMA Substantial Damage Estimator tool, and there's other tools that can help you do this. And when you put this together, what you're really trying to do is see in what different scenarios are structures at risk, so that in advance of the disaster, you already know kind of who's your at-risk properties. If you have a handful of pre-firm properties, everybody else is built later and they're elevated, you can run scenarios and identify those and say, okay, well, these are the ones most likely to be hit. I'm going to focus on outreach and efforts. I know we're at least going to have to go look at those if an event of this magnitude happens. Really helps you plan in advance, communicate with people in advance, things like that. And then turn that into impacts by looking at the dollars. So you can calculate the dollar amount using those tools I mentioned, depth damage, frequency curves, and things like that, that are basically a fancy way of calculating out the deeper the floodwater gets, the more damage it does, how much is that likely to cost based on the square footage and the type of construction. And you can get some damage estimates using HAZUS or these other tools that essentially give you an idea of economically what type of damage you could see based on different scenarios. And you also look at the public infrastructure. It's not just structures. You know, there's a lot of things you could look at. So at the very high fancy level, you can have this really detailed, robust vulnerability analysis. At the very basic level, you can at least have a list of properties in your special flood hazard area that you should keep an eye out to see if they ever have damage of any kind. So both ends work. It's just important to take a look at that in advance. And then this is that summary. If you do a substantial damage plan and your community is participating in the Community Rating System program, under Activity 500, Element 512D, you can get credit. So it's 40 points possible for having a plan, 50 points in addition if the FEMA Substantial Damage Estimator is pre-populated, and you can get another 50 points if you look at mitigation alternatives that could get rid of that risk before an event happens, and you detail that in the plan, align that with your hazard mitigation plan, et cetera. All right, now we're going to transition into post-disaster permitting. I'm going to pause really quick and just see if anybody had any questions about what I've covered so far. Jenny, have you seen anything come in?
I don't have anything in the Q&A or in the chat regarding your presentation thus far.
Okay, great. I'll keep going then. Feel free to put those in if you do have any questions that come up. So now we're going to talk about post-disaster permitting. So going out there after disaster, doing those assessments, making determinations, then people are going to come in and actually want to do the work to repair, substantially improve structures. So why do we have to do permits for them? They're required under the National Flood Insurance Program, but at basic, some talking points you can say for your elected officials, et cetera, so they're going to help communities monitor that development, you know, ensure new development is compliant, follows all the required codes, and protect, you know, future occupants' health and safety. We all want to enter a structure and feel like it's safe, and if someone's going to move and buy in, we want to know they're safe. For floodplain development, building permits and floodplain development permits are not the same thing. And the reason this is because building codes may not require permits for all of the things that a flood ordinance, a floodplain regulations that complies with NFIP minimum standards may require permits for. That's because building codes are focused on buildings, and while there are some requirements for permits for accessory structures or other types of things, in general, you know, you still have electrical code and things that apply. But when it comes to floodplain regulations and the NFIP minimum standards, that definition of development is so broad that there are things like grading, excavation, non-structural development, fill, that would trigger a floodplain permit that may not require a building code or a building permit. It's just important to note the difference there. Activities that require permits in the special flood hazard area, this is just a list of some things that, like I say, may not fall under the building codes. Could be your fill, grading, mining, excavating, or dredging. You know, some types of accessory structures have a pass from building codes depending on the community's building code. Some interior renovations, similar things. So it's quite extensive, once again, because that definition of development is quite extensive. Post-disaster permitting. So you're, after disaster, typically going to be looking, if you've done your messaging right, at least you hope, at a lot of permits coming in if you've had a larger scale disaster. So if you've had a couple hundred homes impacted per se, you know, you might be looking at a lot of permits coming in. Now, they may not all come in at once, depending on people's financial situation, whether they had flood insurance coverage, if it was a flood, you know. It can vary. Sometimes it can take a long time for the last of them to come in, or sometimes a home will sit there for a while, or years even. But typically you get an influx, you know, afterwards. And it's important to have a kind of a coordinated method for how you're going to ramp up and deal with what may be a lot, you know, larger demand for permitting support and processing than what your community is used to. Depending on your community, that might be something you deal with a high demand all the time, so it's not a big deal per se. But for some communities, it might be, you know, quite a change of everyday business. Maybe you're used to getting maybe 1 or 2 permits a week at the most, and now they're going to get an influx of 15 a week or something crazy. It just depends on the situation for your community. Just be sure that in your substantial damage plan, or if you don't have one of those in the actual situation, you take a minute and look at how you're going to process and handle those permits. If you need to adjust your permitting process at all, bring in more staff, what you can do, and then be sure to communicate any changes to standard, you know, procedures to the public, to the people that are going to be applying. Also note, of course, permit fees can be waived, but permit requirements cannot be waived. That's a good one to share with your elected officials. Most floodplain managers already know that, but it's an important one to share. Monitoring permit costs. Encourage, you know, retaining permit files for structures that were not initially determined to be substantially damaged, because it can change depending on the actions of the homeowner or the contractor. So it may be that when they bring in their permit and show just how much damage there was, that something that was borderline, maybe it was, you know, 40%, so it didn't qualify as substantially damaged. When you get a closer look at it, when they bring in the permit files, you may see, oh, actually it was the interior, which you couldn't see very well when you did your assessment, was actually severely damaged and has to be completely redone, and it's definitely a substantial improvement and was substantially damaged. So you don't want to close off, you know, a file and say 100% not, you know, not substantially damaged until you've gone through that permit process and had a look at it in some cases. It really depends on how extensive your assessments were and what you were able to see and look at. Be aware of phased improvements, change orders, scope creep, or unpermitted work, things that can turn something from not being a substantial improvement into a substantial improvement. Some communities have that cumulative substantial improvement. If you do, make sure you've got, you know, tracking for that set up. There's proactive versus reactive permitting. What we call reactive is waiting for contractors and homeowners to come in for permits. Proactive is notifying them that permits are required, giving them the information, forms, etc., while you're conducting your assessments. So going around and when you're doing your substantial damage assessments, if you're interacting with homeowners or if there's a mailbox or a way to leave information at the property, you know, providing that information, the permits are required, how to submit a permit, you know, where the form is, how to do these processes. Doing it at that time tends to get your best result, and that's what we call proactive permitting. An SD determination can be appealed, but the burden is on the homeowner to provide supporting documentation for the appeal. So keep that in mind. Having an appeals process set up and documented, once again, in advance is going to take the pressure off of you if you do get an appeal. Now we're going to transition for a second there to post-disaster funding. So if people come in and they're struggling to cover the costs, they are substantially damaged and they're looking for opportunities to get some financial support to bring it into compliance. Maybe they don't have a NFIP policy, or that increased cost of compliance rider of $30,000 isn't enough, or it wasn't a flood so it doesn't count. Here's some post-disaster funding options that can help with mitigation. Depending on whether a presidential disaster was declared, they may have access to individual assistance. Public assistance is more for your public utilities in your community, things like your roads, your water, utility lines, that kind of a thing, infrastructure. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it's a FEMA-sponsored grant program. The states essentially collect applications from communities, property owners, and then review them and package them and submit them to FEMA. Those programs can provide funding. We're going to dive into those a little bit later that can help with mitigating specific properties. Swift current, we'll talk more about that in just a second, so I won't dive into it too much now. I want to say public assistance, just to clarify, it's assistance to states, tribal, and local governments, and certain private nonprofit organizations for emergency work. The repair or replacement of disaster damaged facilities can include things like debris removal, emergency protective measures, repairing roads and bridges, water control facilities, building equipment, utilities, parks and recs, things like that. For individual assistance, that's assistance that goes directly to the property owner, the household, and that can be things like individual and household programs, crisis counseling, disaster case management, or disaster unemployment assistance, disaster legal services, and the SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the disaster version of that. So there's just some things to keep in mind. So there is an update. Now, this may all be changing again soon, but the recent update, there's a new cash relief program called Serious Needs Assistance for all disasters receiving individual assistance. It gets $750. It's a new displacement assistance. It removes the requirement to do the loan application for Small Business Administration before being considered for some types of assistance. And it can provide some benefits. Now, this is kind of, whether this will remain unchanged is unknown, but this was a change that came through in recent years. Anything on or after March 22nd, 2024. So talking about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the FEMA program, and funding opportunities, the HMGP provides funds to states, tribes, and territories to perform long-term hazard reduction after a major disaster. The goal is to reduce the loss of life and property for future natural disasters. So one example is elevating a lift station to address flooding. Potential savings must be more than the cost of the project, so you have to do a benefit cost analysis. Section 404 of the Stafford Act authorizes this program, and the funds are available statewide once there's a presidentially declared disaster anywhere in the state, but the priority is always given to the communities that were impacted, so that's why I show these tiered programs. So, Tier 1 is the impacted communities with major priority projects. Tier 2 is the minor priority projects for those communities, and then Tier 3 would be any communities in the state not impacted. There's several resources that help develop these mitigation projects. EPA also has guidance to assist in developing mitigation projects for all different types of disasters or hazards. Some of the things that you can do for these aren't your traditional, ones. You can also do things like green infrastructure, floodplain stream restoration, aquifer storage and recovery, things like that. Really, the timeline is if the incident occurs, there's a joint preliminary damage assessment. We call that the JPDAs. If it qualifies, there's a presidential disaster declaration, priority list of projects, notice of funding. The notice of funding is posted. Then there's the application review, and then states submit those applications through to FEMA. FEMA reviews them. Then there's an award project timeline. The thing you want to know about these, and the reason I just listed this long list for the timeline, is it can take 3.5 years total from start to finish for a project to be completed, so the on-the-ground change that was funded to be done. The process isn't always fast for these, so that can be a problem for local property owners that are trying to do, say, a home elevation project under this or something like that. But it is, once again, grant money, and those increased cost of compliance funds can be used as match, so it may be still very of interest to communities and property owners. We've seen a lot of great projects done with these. SWIFT Current Program. This is only awarded for individual flood mitigation projects and only available to repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, and substantially damaged properties. It's similar to the flood mitigation assistance grants, if you're familiar with those. Those are FEMA grants meant to help mitigate flood damage and risk. It's a competitive program, provides funding to states, federally recognized tribes, U.S. territories, and local governments after a major disaster declaration. And as this diagram shows, there's a process. It's a bit faster than the HMGP process, as I said, from kind of start to finish. So 30 days setup period, 120 to 150 days for the eligibility period, and then 36 months to complete the project. Some of the other options that are available are federal disaster loans, small business association loans, home and personal property loans from the Small Business Association, and HUD offers some loans, Federal Housing Authority, FHA 203H loans. I won't dial into these too much, but this Small Business Association, Administration loans, after major disasters are declared, the SBA provides low-interest loans to businesses of all sizes, private nonprofit organizations, homeowners, and renters. And they can be used to repair or replace, damaged or destroyed items like real estate, personal property, machinery and equipment, and inventory and business assets. The home and personal property loan that you can get through the SBA is up to $200,000 for home repair or replacement and up to $40,000 for personal property. They're low interest rate, like 1.75% per se for applicants unable to obtain credit elsewhere. And then if somebody normally could qualify for credit elsewhere, it's a slightly higher rate. It's like 3.5% last time we looked at it. The SBA determines whether applicants can obtain credit elsewhere and then determines what loan terms they're going to offer them. Physical damage is one potential thing that can be done. Mitigation, actions that you can do from this could be elevating flood-prone structures, relocating utilities, retrofitting structures, fixing retaining walls, things like that. The FHA 203H loans, maximum loan amount for that depends on the area. So it's area specific, and it depends on the FHA mortgage limit for that area. So somewhere between, say, $275,000 and $640,000, depending on where you are in the U.S. So no down payment required. Borrowers are eligible for 100% financing. And these are essentially, can be used for home repairs, replacement, relocation, things like that. So last thing I want to cover, on other federal programs, there's this cool Army Corps of Engineers program called Operation Blue Roof, and it provides temporary covering of blue plastic sheeting to help reduce further damage until permanent repairs can be made. It's a less known program, so I just like to add it in here. The Blue Roof is a reinforced waterproof plastic material. It's designed to last 30 days, so it's not a long-term solution, but it can really be great in a pinch when people need it. All right, now we're going to move into the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. This also kind of addresses funding. So federal assistance, public assistance program to communities after major disaster declarations, so you need a presidential disaster declaration. What this does is it covers and provides some reimbursement for activities done during the 180 days after the disaster declaration. So it can help communities with the cost of managing a number of activities I'm about to run through. And some of them are things related to building codes administration, like the review and processing of building permits after a disaster, training and outreach related to that, inspections, code enforcement, corrective actions, things like that. Floodplain ordinance administration enforcement, including post-disaster permitting that we were just talking about, and substantial damage determinations. So conducting those field surveys, collecting the data, preparing the repair cost and market value information, et cetera. That's all things that are covered and can be reimbursed under the DRRA 1206. And so we're going to go over a few more of these in a second, but one thing I want to say now, the key for reimbursement is documentation. So when we were talking about having a plan in advance, so let's take, for example, the substantial damage determinations. When you're going to go out and have people going out to specific areas and charging their time or hours to that, if you have a plan in place and can document where they went and how long they spent and who went where and what work they did, that's going to make it way easier to file for reimbursement later. So just a little plug there. So work examples, the kind of categories of work that's covered is building code administration and code enforcement, floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement, and substantial damage determinations. And we're going to break down each one of those here. I won't read these all off, but basically you can get funding if you need to bring in additional resources to help with building code administration and code enforcement. You can get funding and reimbursement for that. Just remember that 180 days time frame. It can be to hire, train, supervise, certify, or license staff to do these awards. And if you contract services, it can cover the cost of that contract too. Some communities have, as part of their substantial damage planning, identified they would need some support from contractors per se in a larger disaster scenario. And so they may have established like standing contracts that are just sitting there and just get pinged if a disaster actually happens. And in that case, if you're going to ramp up and pay a contractor to do part of this and assist you, you can use and get reimbursement for that as long as you have the right documentation under this DRA 1206. There's some things here for inspections and reviewing and issuing elevation certificates. We haven't talked much about that, but the past training you all had was on elevation certificates. And really, there can be a bit of work to review with those. It's a very detailed process, so you can get reimbursement for folks that are doing that related to disaster activity. You get permits come in, and they have multiple elevation certificates that can be associated with them. An elevation certificate is a certificate that documents and certifies the elevation of key elements for a structure, such as the lowest floor, the electrical, et cetera. Also documents the base flood elevation, so how high the water is going to get, that 1% annual chance flood, and is kind of used as an official record to show the comparison between the two. You know, where is your water height going to be? What elevation is your structure and structural elements at? It's a formal certificate that documents that. So monitoring impacted areas for unpermitted construction activities, that's another thing that you can actually fund out of this, that some of those enforcement provisions the communities can take advantage of. Some of the other things are related to floodplain management ordinance and administration and enforcement. So enforcing or administering standards for development. Basically, what you would normally do as a floodplain manager, you know, taking your ordinance, applying it, reviewing permits to see if they comply with your ordinance provisions or your regulatory provisions. That's something that you may have to do a lot more of post-disaster situation when you get a higher number of permits coming in. You can get reimbursement if you need to bring on more staff, you know, spend additional hours. You staff it normally a part-time person and you need them to do it full-time, that kind of thing. You can also use it to help staff get certified as certified floodplain managers, things like that. The hard thing there is that it really is, for that time period, only 180 days after the presidential disaster declaration. That goes by fast. So getting somebody certified or hired on, et cetera, it can be harder to get reimbursement for those things, but it still is eligible. A couple of final things, training and outreach to the public. This is a great one. You know, that extra cost of having to go out and do some public meetings, spending more time in the field, engaging, going to where people are already meeting, community groups, et cetera, and engaging. That cost can be reimbursed under DRA 1206. That review, processing of the permits for disaster-related development, things like temporary occupancy. So, like, for example, wildfires in my area in 2020, they were able, you know, to use this for reimbursement for the time it took to process the permits to put kind of these temporary housing units in places, things like that. You can also use it to provide information on flood hazards, flood map data, because it's only for that 180 days, you're not going to fund a whole flood study per se after it, but if you need to stand up a temporary web service or website or data viewer or dashboard or something like that that shows flood hazard data or information, you can do that and get potentially reimbursement for that under DRA 1206. And the last segment of things that are reimbursable, substantial damage determinations, which we've been focusing on for this training. That effort you're doing to conduct those initial field surveys, if you need to bring in additional staff, external staff, train them, provide them with field data collection tools, maybe you get that Survey 123 app set up or something like that. And I'm not associated with that app in any way. I've just used it, so I'm going to be plugging it so much. But if you're using an app or using whatever tool you're going to use for data collection or populate the FEMA SDE tool, things like that, you can get reimbursement for that. Anything that is part of the substantial damage determination process, as long as you can document who did it, what time they spent on it, what they did specifically. You know, having logs are a really good way to track your work and to get reimbursement, because those logs will help you, or very detailed timesheets or something can be a good way to ensure you can qualify for reimbursement. Last few things are the inspections, you know, to ensure compliance with the requirements for SD. Now, depending on the timeline for permitting, whether that happens within that 180 days or not may vary, but if you need to do some research and spend hours and time and have some staff dedicated to looking at whether any of the structures are historic or designated as historic and might be eligible for exemptions from the SISD requirements, you can get reimbursement for that here as well. So quite a few things that this can cover. Now, I just want to go over a few things it doesn't cover. These are kind of the important ones. You can't get credit for anything that isn't disaster damage facility. So if you're processing other permits, you can't get reimbursed for that. You can only get reimbursed for the permits related to repairing the structures that were damaged. Updating your regulations. So if you decide to change your community's floodplain regulations or write a new SOP or do a new substantial damage plan, you can't get credit for that and reimbursement. So by credit, I mean you don't get reimbursed for it. There's things like this, developing new land use plans, updating building codes, et cetera. None of that's eligible. So the key documentation for reimbursement: to receive reimbursement, you have to submit all supporting documentation needed to demonstrate that the work completed and the location of the work was all done, you know, through and qualifies. So if there was work done through Emergency Mutual Assistance Compact, or EMAC, where you had interstate or interlocal mutual aid requests, essentially other states or communities lent you their staff to come help you in the situation. EMAC is a common tool for that, and you'd need documentation of all of that. If work was performed by contractors or contracted labor, you need documentation showing that the federal procurement rules in Section 2, Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Part 200 were followed. So you just need to show that your contract met those requirements. FEMA may also require communities provide documentation demonstrating that the eligible activities are in support of the community's legally adopted building code or floodplain ordinance. So normally that's providing them a copy of your ordinance, links to your building code, showing that the contract you've established for any contracted labor meets those requirements, documenting any assistance you got through EMAC. The other thing is, you know, having logs to show if you brought in internal staff, but they were just being reused. So maybe you had somebody that normally just does plan review and isn't related to floodplain, and you use them for this process. You'd need a log to show the time they spent on these specific post-disaster activities and that were, you know, eligible for reimbursement. That's why the logs can come in handy. So last thing for document reimbursement, you know, you want to show documentation like the SD inspections, determinations, and letters, et cetera. So you need to have evidence to show that you did that work and provide that. They may also be requested. There's been a lot of questions around the DRRA 1206 fact document, so we actually have a fact documents clarification slide. The FAQs, frequently asked questions document, these are some clarifications, things that are asked quite often of FEMA, et cetera. So major disaster declarations are made by the President based off information collected during the Joint Preliminary Damage Assessment, the JPDA. Those filter, up normally from, say, a city to a county level, for example, to state to, the presidential disaster declaration. Specific counties still need to be included in the declaration. You can find a map of designated counties on FEMA's website. The designation for disaster, presidential declared disaster, can vary. So it'll either be designated for individual assistance or public assistance or both. And public assistance, like I say, should be either emergency or permanent work. So there's some distinctions. Counties that are designated for public assistance emergency work, categories A and B only, are not eligible for Disaster Recovery Reform Act 1206 reimbursement. So this is a really important caveat. It must be under PA permanent work. So you have to have a presidential disaster declaration that includes public assistance permanent work. If you have one for public assistance emergency work only, then you may not be eligible for DRA 1206 reimbursement. Declarations can be amended. Sometimes the initial data collected from the JPDA is amended, and a designation can change. So you could become eligible after the fact. The reason you always want to pay attention there is that it's the date the presidential disaster declaration is issued, a qualifying one, that triggers the start of that 180 days for the period that you're eligible. The activities you do within that period is what you're eligible for reimbursement for. So if it changes, that date it changes is your start date. No extensions. FEMA will not extend the deadline beyond 180 days. This has been tested quite frequently. So that's the overview for Disaster Recovery Reform Act 1206. We're going to do a knowledge check really quick, and then we're going to pivot through our last resources and tools section and then have a Q&A. So hopefully you're all still with me. I know that was a lot. First question here, true or false? Under the Community Rating System program, can you get credit if you're a participating community and you have an SD plan? If you want to put in the chat if you think it is true or false. Give everybody just a second. I'm seeing trues. And yes, that's correct. You can. And as I mentioned before, the credit varies. It's 40 points just for a plan, and then there's additional points you can get for doing other activities, like populating the FEMA SDE tool in advance. Okay, another true and false question. Placement of temporary structures within the regulatory floodplain requires a floodplain development permit. True or false? Give everybody a sec to answer. Yep, that's true. The definition of development is extremely broad, so things like temporary structures definitely require floodplain permit. Okay, and the last one, Disaster Recovery Reform Act 1206, Section 1206, only provides reimbursement for activities conducted within the first 160 days after a presidential disaster declaration. Is that true or false? This one's a little tricky. I know I said it a lot, but it is similar. This one's actually false. The correct answer is 180 days. So close, but a little different. That's one of the key things to remember. If you remember nothing else about 1206, definitely remember it's 180 days. As anything past that, it isn't reimbursable. Okay. I'll pause real quick. Any questions about everything we've just covered? Jenny, just checking in again. Anything in the chat or the Q&A?
Hi, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A or the chat at this time.
Okay, we'll go forward. Last section we're going to go through is tools and resources. We've covered some of those as we went, but I know I've mentioned the substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference quite a few times. It's a great tool, but I want to go over a few others. So some resources. These are available from FEMA. They're FEMA publications. A couple of these are really focused on the communities, and other examples we're going to talk through are focused on things you give to the public. So the first one, Myths and Facts about the National Flood Insurance Program, great one to pass out to property owners or the public. It's also not a bad one to give to elected officials. There's also the benefits of flood insurance versus disaster assistance. That one's very eye-opening for people. I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what disaster assistance is really going to offer them and don't understand that normally it's the form of a loan, not really at least the substantial amount of the funding. And so why there's a benefit to having flood insurance versus relying on that. So these are a couple good resources. This one I know I've already talked about ad nausea. There is some really great tools in here that local communities can use for their own substantial damage programs, whether they're making a substantial damage plan or not. One is there's sample documents here that you can tailor, that they've already done all the legwork for you. Notices to property owners, substantial damage determination letters, affidavits, all types of things here. There's even an adjuster preliminary damage assessment form. Letters of determination, and there's 3 different options, sample versions that are provided. These work really well. There's the one for work that constitutes substantial improvement, one where you've designated it as substantially damaged, and another where the work does not constitute repair of substantial damage, and that's the same as saying it's not a substantial improvement. These are in the appendices. There's a whole section at the back that's really great. There's also the FEMA Substantial Damage Estimator tool, and I'm going to dig into this one for a little bit here. We're going to spend the next few minutes walking through this in some level of detail. So this is FEMA's estimator tool. There is a user manual field workbook. The last update I've got on it was a 2017 version. And this is a digital tool and a whole methodology that goes with it for how you can estimate substantial damage in your community. So you populate this tool that FEMA built with GIS data, and then you can import photos, you can capture latitude, longitude, you can put data in here that you collect in the field, and it can populate out and prepare estimates. So if you fill in your flood hazard risk and your structure, basic structure information into this tool, you can get a really rough cut estimate of what potential damage would be depending on the flood event that you enter and some of the details you enter. You can build it out really detailed by putting in lots of information about structures. You can populate it with your field findings, your photos and assessment data. It's a great tool. It does a lot for you. If you're just looking at 3 houses, it can be overkill if you don't have it pre-populated. If you're doing any large numbers of houses, highly recommend using this tool, which is why I'm going to walk through it a little bit here. The users, make some judgment calls on this, and it's a tool, it's a calculator, so garbage in, garbage out. Just keep that in mind. It's great for doing this rapid estimation of damage assessments. You put in, your determinations and your data, and it can give you some really great outputs quickly. So users input their determinations, for 3 separate data fields: the initial construction quality, the depreciation rating of the structure prior to damage, the percent damage, and like each of 12 construction elements for residential structures or 7 elements for non-residential structures. So there's a lot of data and information you're putting into it. Pre-populating this before the disaster is great because that gives you time when you're not under duress to think through and look at what data you have and fill this out really well, and then it's sitting there ready for you to use. So a little bit more about the tool. It's a computer software downloaded directly onto a PC. It's not web-based, not an application. Because of that, it's not accessible through tablets or cell phones, although I've seen some people do some kind of workarounds. Some communities use ArcGIS field maps. Some might use Survey 123. Others can use tablets with Excel sheets or even paper sheets. And they may or may not, go input that data later into the SDE tool. A lot of people are kind of scared of this tool, think it costs money, or don't like that it's unavailable on tablets. We're hoping that's something that changes in the future. It's really not scary. It's actually pretty straightforward. And if a community doesn't have GIS capabilities, it's still a good way to capture data. It can actually create a nice little GIS repository of some flood data for them. So using this tool, it estimates. It doesn't make determinations. It gives you estimates. So you should have estimates and determinations on file, especially for structures with estimates that are close, within that 50% range. So I want to emphasize it is a tool to make field estimates. It isn't going to give you your final determinations. I guess I've seen people get really caught up in numbers. Like, would you say this is 23% damaged or 24% damaged? The rule of thumb is to go by increments of 5% until you can get better cost estimates if necessary. You want to maintain thorough documentation for all SD estimates, including, any reversals of substantial damage determinations. Supporting materials can always change the ultimate determination because, again, in the field, we can only be so accurate. Sometimes we can't see inside the building, which quite frequently, sometimes we can't see the whole building. It may significantly change the ultimate percentage calculation. So the documentation community, that you're going to maintain, you want to include all the supporting materials. So when you're looking at an SDE tool, you're going to collect data to do some rapid estimates to see where you're likely to have damage and what the level of damage is going to be. And then you can refine that by adding in data that you've collected in the field and get a great picture here. But you still need to make your official determinations yourself. You need to have somebody review it and make a determination and write a letter. It's not going to spit that letter out for you. So common language that you're going to see in the SDE tool, structure attributes. These are just the individual parts of a building. So foundation, roof, superstructure, your frame, things like that. Because of the type of construction can affect the element, percentage of the value of the structure, it's important to fill these out accurately as possible, but it's okay if you're not entirely sure. You can make your best guess. Make sure to note somewhere that you're unsure and take good photos. Cost adjustments are add-ons or adjustments to the cost that include additional building features, not part of the basic building. This can be things like a fireplace, a porch, upgraded roofing. Basically, you're updating the base cost to say, well, they've got this fancy thing here. Maybe they've got a really fancy, extensive rock fireplace or something like that. To also factor in the adjustment, that way you can add for these unique situations, a cost adjustment. The element percentages tab is used by the inspector to enter the percent damaged values. So you've got structure attributes, you've got cost adjustments to that, and then you've got element percentages. It's used by the inspector. They're going to enter the percent damaged values to the field inspector, and this could be a floodplain manager. It may not be an official, somebody that has a role, inspector. It's whoever is doing your substantial damage assessments. Based on rapid visual evaluation for each of the elements, there's 12, like I said. These align with the structure attributes, not 100% entirely, but close. But the attributes is important because it can change the way the element percentages are calculated. For example, you don't want to have no for HVAC unit and then put the HVAC unit as being 50% damaged. So you should have, your structure attributes should align with whether they have an HVAC unit or not. And then you're going to enter element percentages, that reflect what the damage was for each of those structural attributes, kind of thing. The fields will differ depending on if the assessment is for a residential or a non-residential structure. So break that down here for you a little bit. Residential structures, these are the key fields. You've got the elements, the square footage, photos or files, and the ability to import structure data. You can also do custom, up to 3 custom data fields. And then residential structure attributes, foundation type, exterior finish, roof covering, superstructure, number of stories. Is it 1 story, 2 story, or more, and your HVAC system, things like that. So just want to explain superstructure. Not everybody may be familiar with constructional terms. So superstructure includes all the framing that provides structural support and a load path between the foundation and the roof. So the purpose of the SDE tool, the following superstructure options are available for residential structures. These represent the majority of the superstructure types that you're going to see within communities. You know, you've got stud frame, kind of your standard, and that has some type of covering over it, like siding, etc. Common brick. You know, brick units stacked and mortared together make up the exterior wall, provide that exterior structural system. The interior system can be wood framed or it could be additional brick, depends on the type of building. And these can either be reinforced or unreinforced using steel rods. Got insulating concrete form, this one's getting more popular, uses a synthetic insulation forming system, you know, filled with concrete, requires an exterior finish, so either brick veneer, stucco, or siding, something to provide water resistance. And then you've got standard masonry, so concrete masonry units, CMUs, they call it. These are stacked, mortared together, make up the exterior wall, provide that exterior structure system. So the interior system can be wood framed or, could be additional CMU wall units, wall systems. They're either reinforced or unreinforced. So this superstructure type can have no exterior finish. It could just be that concrete, or it could have some type of concrete, traditional cement-based stucco. Exterior insulation finishing systems can also be there. So we bring this up as we're talking about different structures. One of the things you're going to look at is superstructure. So here are some examples out in the field, if you're looking at it, of different superstructure types. Stud framed, your common brick, your masonry, and your insulating concrete forms, ICF. So these are some of the examples, and if you're going to be populating information for the SDE tool, you're going to be kind of evaluating what this is. For that structure, the roof coverings, asphalt, clay tiles, slate roofs, or metal seam roofs. Sorry, standing seam metal roof. Common roof coverings used throughout the U.S. that are kind of similar in performance and cost. The standard shingle roofs are considered as standard shingles. So it reduces the number of, options to make it simpler. Exterior finishes. So the exterior finish system's primary contributions to a structure is weatherproofing and aesthetics. I can't say that day. Weatherproofing and aesthetics. So it's not structural, it's non-structural. They're not required in the wall material, but it's something that most construction has. So it could be siding, could be brick veneer, things like that. HVAC systems, number of stories. So the SDE tool, defaults to residential structures having an HVAC system, but you can select no HVAC. The number of stories is important. If only a portion of the home has a second story, you can select 2 stories and add a note. So this is the type of information you're filling out for the SDE for a residential structure. It's really not that bad, not that rough. The SDE features for non-residential. So the SDE tool contains the most common non-residential structure types, but it doesn't provide for every possible combination of number of stories and structure use, etc. If the tool doesn't provide an exact match for the structure use, after the number of stories has been selected, then you can select the structure use closest to their actual attributes. Sometimes this isn't going to be perfect. You try to get it as close as you can. A note on whether the structure is residential or non-residential. FEMA guidance states that you are to look at the original construction intent. So don't think about the current use, think about the original construction purpose. You've seen real estate or law firms, maybe some medical offices that are operating out of like an old historic structure, like a residential building that was originally built for residential use. So in those cases, you would complete a residential assessment. So you really want to look at what the original intent was when it was designed, and if it's something that would typically be considered a residential home being used for commercial use, you want to evaluate it under residential. And conveyance systems, this is something that can confuse people a bit. These include escalators and elevators, and it can affect the electrical element percentage. So the tool has an option for conveyance systems in a 2 to 4 story structure. So you're only really going to deal with that in larger structures. The default is always no conveyance system, but you can add that in if there is one. I mean, there may be a situation where you have a 1-story one, but it's a pretty rare thing, so that's something you'd want to just note if that was the case. And then essentially you're going to be estimating damages. So Appendix E and F of the SCE user manual provide some guidance for estimating the percent damage for residential and non-residential structures respectively. So all the details and the exact like what field to fill in, et cetera, you can go and look into this guide, and it's going to walk you through in extensive details. But I just wanted to show that the information you need to populate those SDE tools, you know, is not that heavy of a lift. A lot of community assessor data has a lot of that information. And GIS data, your flood mapping information. There's a lot of existing information a lot of communities can use to populate it. If you're a CRS participating community, you get some extra points under the SDP planning, 50 points for populating this in advance. Having it populated in advance is great in case you do have a larger disaster, especially if you're a community that has, you know, more than 100 structures at risk of damage within your special flood hazard area. The last thing I want to talk about a bit is photo documentation. So whether you're using the SDE tool or not, you can't specify or stress enough the importance of photo documentation. I don't know how many times I've had situations where being able to refer back to those photos have helped kind of alleviate situations where a property owner is claiming one thing and it's not aligning with what the notes in the write-up are saying. So we recommend if you're going to be in the field taking photos, taking a whiteboard like this, you can take photos where you write the address on it, you take a picture there. It's just a great, even if you're using an app, it's a great backup and support. Once again, if you're working in teams of 2, et cetera, this is pretty easy to do. It's just a great approach to do. You always want at least 2 photos. The SDE tool requires at least 2 photos. You want to try to take a front-facing photo as well as an angled one. If you can take photos of the entire structure, that's great. It's helpful to capture any high watermarks in the photo. And a couple things. Make sure you don't get anybody's faces in the photos. And if possible, you know, try to have it aligned so that the whiteboard doesn't cover any part of the structure that you're trying to review or consider. Well, that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for your time and attendance. Hopefully this was beneficial.